began on a summer evening in Missoula, Montana. Jermain Charlo, a 22-year-old Indian indigenous mother of two, was walking through the city center. People remember seeing her. Cameras recorded her steps. Her phone was still active. And then, nothing. She was gone, and no one could explain why. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Jermain Charlo was born on April 30th, 1996. She was a proud member of the Salish Confederacy and the Kootenai of the Flathead people. Growing up between the Flathead Indian Reservation and the city of Missoula, Germaine grew up surrounded by cultural heritage and contemporary issues that shaped her identity. At various points in her youth, Germaine moved between the reservation and Missoula. These shifts were often related to family circumstances or the search for greater opportunities. While Missoula offered better access to jobs and educational programs, it also posed new challenges: a break with tradition, difficulty maintaining cultural identity in a predominantly white city, and increased exposure to systemic bias. Her life wasn't easy, but there were many people who cared about her and people she cared about in return. She was known among friends and relatives for her sense of humor and energy. She loved music, spending time outdoors, and especially valued her connections with her family and community. From a young age, Germaine showed resilience. Like many children who grew up in poor neighborhoods, she faced setbacks, but she wouldn't let them define her. She had ambitions, dreams of building a stable, safe, and completely her own life. As a teenager, Germaine was involved in relationships that friends and family say were often unstable. Some of them were marked by emotional manipulation, others about financial dependence. There were times when it experienced difficulties, economic, emotional, but he was not deprived of resources. Her family, especially her grandmother and relatives, always stayed. They offered childcare, transportation, a place to sleep, or just a phone call when she needed to calm down. Her first child was born before she was even on her feet. By the age of 22, she had 2 children and was actively working on the possibility of guardianship. Germaine was a mother. She raised 2 boys and worked to build a future that would provide them with stability. People close to her say that she often talked about improving her life, not only for herself, but also for them. She wanted more than she was given and was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. But life in rural Montana, especially for women, was very difficult. By the spring of 2018, Germaine was working to bring her life back into balance. She recently returned to Missoula, stayed with friends, studied local programs for work and education, and tried to regain custody of her children. Those who saw her at the time described her as optimistic. Even when she faced setbacks, she seemed focused on the future. She had strong connections. Her family, especially her grandmother, played an important role. Germaine rarely lost touch for more than a few hours, and when she did, someone always noticed. Around this time, she began to make more concrete plans for the future, applying to community colleges and adult education programs. She talked about becoming a paramedic or working in the tribal health field. She wanted something stable, something that gave her a role and a way forward. But even as she made plans, her life remained fragile. She often couch-surfed, relying on friends to find temporary housing. Sometimes she spent nights with relatives, in other cases, acquaintances or former partners. Her relationships were not always secure or stable, and her status as a young woman from a tribe facing housing instability made her particularly vulnerable, especially in a system that too often failed to recognize early warning signs. Nevertheless, she tried. People close to her say that Germaine was aware of the risks. She knew the statistics. She knew of other Native American women who had gone missing. She was careful, kept an eye on what was going on around her, and rarely went out without telling someone. This is what made her disappearance so shocking. On June 16, 2018, the girl disappeared. In the early morning of June 17, 2018, it became clear to those closest to Germaine that something was wrong. Very strange. Her absence wasn't just inexplicable, it wasn't in his character. She did not pick up the phone, and the messages remained unread. Within hours, the habitual anxiety of every Native American family began to take shape. Not panic, but a growing sense of urgency based on experience. The first step was simple. Start making calls. Germain's family reached out to friends, ex-partners, cousins, and acquaintances. Has anyone seen it? Did she talk about plans to go somewhere? Could she have stayed somewhere unexpectedly for the night? One by one, these questions returned the same answer. No. They checked the local hospitals and the prison, but it did not give any results. By noon, they filed a missing person report with the Missoula Police Department. At that point, her case fell into a system that often investigated women like her. Germain's family did not accept the advice to wait 48 hours, but continued to make a fuss about the case. Germain's cousin created a Facebook page dedicated to her case, which quickly gained momentum. Rumors spread through tribal networks, nonprofit organizations led by indigenous peoples, and community activists. What started as a local search quickly grew into something bigger, both in scale and significance. But even though her story has garnered attention, there have been structural barriers that have slowed the pace. Since Germaine was a registered member of the tribe and disappeared within the city limits, her case became complex in terms of jurisdiction. The FBI has the legal authority to investigate serious crimes involving Native Americans under the Serious Crimes Act. But their involvement is not automatic. During the trial in 2020, it was revealed that some pieces of information, including key footage from surveillance cameras and interviews with witnesses, were not thoroughly studied within the first 48 hours. This delay may have contributed to the difficulty in tracking Germaine's final movements. By the time federal agents joined this effort, the critical leads had already begun to disappear. But the search work under the leadership of the community began almost immediately. Volunteers combed nearby forests, riverbanks, and abandoned houses. Local entrepreneurs agreed to hang leaflets. Tribal leaders have issued formal appeals for cooperation. And within a week, the Salish and Kootenai Confederation issued a statement calling for full coordination between the agencies. But perhaps the most powerful force behind the constant attention to Germaine's case was his family. Her friends, cousins, and elders organized walks, vigils, and public gatherings. They drew signs. They held prayer circles. They were standing on the steps of the courthouse with photographs of Germaine in their hands. It wasn't just statistics. She was one of them. As the weeks turned into months, the matter became more and more prominent. Journalists began to get in touch with the family. Human rights organizations, including Native Women's Wilderness and the Sovereign Bodies Institute, expanded her story. The hashtag #Justice for Germaine began appearing online along with other names of missing Indigenous women. Her face became part of a wider movement. But even as public interest grew, there was still no trace of Germaine. There are no confirmed observations, no phone activity. After June 16th, there are no confirmed digital traces. The lack of evidence became a serious problem, not only for investigators, but also for those who tried to keep the case secret. News coverage is going well. When there are no events, the media move on. Germaine's family wouldn't let that happen. They kept ringing. He continued to organize. He continued to appear at every press conference, at every public meeting, at every candlelight vigil. And gradually, something began to change. Not in her case directly, but in the national dialogue. In 2019, members of Congress began introducing a bill to address the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Crisis, MMIW. Germaine's case was one of several mentioned in the hearings and reports. Montana, in particular, has become a flashpoint, recognized as both the severity of the crisis and the activism of local indigenous communities. For Charlo's family, this visibility was important, but it was not enough. They wanted answers, and not legislation, unawareness. They wanted to know what had happened to Germaine. Who saw her for the last time? What did she say that evening? And why did no one make a statement? As the search for Germaine intensified in the summer of 2018, investigators began to investigate who had been in contact with her in the hours leading up to her disappearance. One name quickly became central to this timeline: Joseph Dixon. Dixon was familiar to the Germaine family and had been romantically involved with them at various times in the past. Their relationship, according to many accounts, was complex and sometimes stormy. Friends described a dynamic that alternated between intimacy and distance, with periods of reconciliation followed by conflict. Some thought that Germaine was trying to get away from the relationship. For others, the connection between them still remained, complicated by shared history, social circles, and unresolved emotions. Dixon had a criminal record. Prior to Germaine's disappearance, he was involved in several court cases, including drug-related crimes and incidents involving domestic disturbances. He was serving time in a state prison and was known to law enforcement. This story made him more visible to investigators after Germaine went missing. But it also made him careful. He did not publicly communicate with the media and did not participate in the search work. He did not attend all-night vigils and did not testify to his family. For many, this silence was alarming. This created distance, suspicion, and a growing sense that Dixon knew more than he said. According to early reports, Germaine was in contact with Dixon shortly before her disappearance. Some witnesses claimed that she spoke of plans to meet with him on the night of June 16, 2018. This information, although not confirmed immediately after that, was enough for Dixon to come under the close attention of law enforcement agencies. Investigators tried to interrogate him for several days after her disappearance. Dixon, who reportedly initially cooperated, declined further interviews after a brief conversation with police. He did not give details about his whereabouts that night, citing memory lapses and a reluctance to get involved in what he called a family affair. His car, a black 1990s Chevrolet pickup truck, matched the description of a truck seen near where Germaine was last seen. Footage from surveillance cameras obtained later shows that at that time there was a truck of a similar brand and color nearby. While not conclusive, it has added weight to the theory that Dixon may have been one of the last to see her. Over the following weeks, law enforcement agencies began collecting data, phone records, text messages, location data. Much of that evidence has not been made public, but court documents filed years later confirmed that federal agents were already plotting a schedule. The focus was on Dixon's movements, his digital footprint, and personal history. But there was a complication. With no body, no physical evidence from the crime scene, and no direct witness testimony, the case remained officially classified as a missing person investigation. This classification limited what law enforcement agencies could publicly declare and what steps they could take without further justification. For Germaine's family, Dixon's silence was hard to bear. They knew him. He was warmly received in family circles. And now, at a time when every detail mattered, he offered nothing. Despite this, the family remained cautious. They did not accuse them publicly. They focused on awareness, on keeping the case active in the eyes of the public. But deep down, they wanted answers, and Dixon was one of the few who could get them. In 2019, federal authorities confirmed that Dixon had been imprisoned on unrelated charges. He remained behind bars for violating parole and drug-related crimes. While it wasn't directly related to Germaine's case, his incarceration kept him within reach of investigators, who continued to gather evidence behind the scenes. By 2020, the FBI admitted that Dixon had a motive. But still, no charges were brought, and Germaine remained missing. Jermain Charlo's last confirmed sighting occurred on the night of Saturday, June 16, 2018, in downtown Missoula, Montana. It was a warm summer evening, and the city center was filled with the energy typical of a weekend evening. Restaurants were closing, crowds in bars were changing, and street lamps cast long shadows along Higgins Avenue. That evening, Germaine was seen in the company of friends and acquaintances, moving between places in the city. According to verified witness testimony, she had attended a public event earlier in the night and appeared to be in good spirits. There were no signs of distress. She was dressed casually, her phone was active, and she was planning to meet someone later that evening. Footage from several security cameras showed it near the intersection of Orange Street and West Broadway around midnight. In the available footage, she seems to be walking calmly. There are no visible signs of confrontation here, and nothing unusual shows up right away. However, this timestamp is the last known confirmed image of Jermain Charlo. After this moment, he disappears from sight. Phone records indicate that her mobile phone stopped transmitting data shortly thereafter. Authorities later confirmed that her phone was either manually turned off or discharged due to a dead battery. After that, no more pings were detected from her device. According to several sources, Germaine was supposed to return or get in touch the next morning. When she didn't, family members became worried. Several people mentioned that she may have planned to meet Joseph Dixon that evening, though no one could confirm exactly when or where. One unverified sighting showed a woman matching Germaine's description getting into a dark-colored pickup truck near an intersection in the city center shortly after midnight. Although this lead was noted in the initial police report, investigators have not publicly confirmed or denied whether it was her. The truck was described as old, possibly black, with a loud muffler, a description that matched the type of vehicle known to be driven by Dixon at the time. In the critical 48 hours after Germaine's disappearance, several opportunities to preserve and analyze new evidence may have been missed. The area where she was last seen was not immediately designated as a potential crime scene. Nearby recordings from CCTV cameras, if they were not preserved by private enterprises, could be overwritten in subsequent days. Witnesses who could have seen something were identified and interviewed only a few weeks later. Canine units were involved. The drones scanned isolated sections of the Clark Fork River and surrounding fields. Law enforcement officials teamed up with tribal police and federal agents for a coordinated search, but none yielded results. Now her case has taken a familiar but painful path for many families of missing Indigenous women. The first hours, critical for collecting actionable leads, passed with limited activity. Now they were working backwards, reconstructing movements, tracking down reluctant witnesses, and relying on incomplete data. Despite these challenges, support from the community remained strong. Rallies were held. Her name was read aloud at vigils in memory of missing and murdered Indigenous women in other cities. Even though the number of leads slowed down, the visibility of her story continued to grow. Investigators focused on the video and began to compile a possible version of the disappearance. However, without physical evidence or direct witness testimony, the case remained unsolved. By 2021, the case of Jermain Charlo had remained frozen in the status of missing person for over 3 years. No suspects had been formally charged, no indictments had been issued, and no concrete explanations had emerged regarding her disappearance. For her family and supporters, this wasn't just an unsolved case. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, emblematic of how institutions frequently fall short when addressing the disappearances of Indigenous women. Despite persistent community efforts, vigils, and social campaigns, the official status of the case remained unchanged. The lack of progress, however, had not diminished public attention. If anything, the prolonged absence of resolution made the story of Germaine even more pressing. In the early months of 2021, the Charlo family renewed their advocacy with greater determination. They continued to speak out, organize public gatherings, and maintain visibility in the media. What began as a local effort had transformed into a sustained campaign reaching far beyond Montana. They coordinated with national MMIW organizations, legal experts, and independent journalists to compile timelines, review gaps in the initial investigation, and draw attention to procedural missteps that occurred during the critical early days. One of their primary goals was to advocate for meaningful legislative reform that would mandate cross-jurisdictional collaboration in cases involving Indigenous victims, especially when disappearances occur off-reservation lands. By the middle of 2021, their campaign had reached state lawmakers. Meetings were held between tribal representatives and members of Montana's legislature to discuss reforms in reporting, data collection, and interagency cooperation. One of the critical issues highlighted by Germaine's case was the lack of clarity around who has investigative authority in cases involving Native citizens. This legal ambiguity had slowed the early stages of the search for Germaine, and the family hoped future reforms could prevent similar delays for others. Despite some momentum in the legislative space, no law could retroactively correct missed opportunities in Germaine's investigation. At the same time, law enforcement officials claimed the case remained open and active. However, the lack of public updates contributed to a growing sense of frustration among her supporters. The FBI had assumed partial oversight of the case in late 2018, yet no new developments had been shared publicly. Internal documents later revealed that multiple agencies had submitted status updates to federal databases classifying Germaine's case as inactive pending further leads, even while outwardly maintaining that it was active. This discrepancy fueled calls for external oversight and raised additional questions about transparency in missing persons investigations involving Indigenous individuals. In 2022, the family and their legal team took further steps to compel movement. They filed Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests to access law enforcement records pertaining to Germaine's case, including any notes, interviews, and surveillance footage collected in the days following her disappearance. Much of the requested material was withheld under exemptions related to ongoing investigations, a standard response in unresolved cases. Still, the act of requesting the documents highlighted their persistent efforts and sent a clear signal that the family was prepared to pursue answers by every legal and institutional avenue available. Meanwhile, private efforts continued to fill the investigative vacuum. A retired law enforcement officer with experience in missing persons cases volunteered his services to help the family reassemble a clearer timeline using publicly known data. He reviewed digital footprints, social media activity, and witness accounts, and concluded that the hours between 11:45 p.m. and 2 a.m. on the night of June 16 to 17, 2018, were most critical. While not in possession of official phone records, he believed that this window likely contained the pivotal moments that could determine whether Germaine's disappearance involved foul play or an accident. Without official access to forensic tools, though, his findings were largely speculative and unable to be acted upon by authorities. At the same time, organizations like the Sovereign Bodies Institute and the Urban Indian Health Institute were producing reports that cited Germaine's case among dozens of similar cases that had seen limited progress. These reports highlighted common patterns: missing evidence logs, failed communication between departments, reluctance to involve federal agencies, and general underreporting. Germaine's case became one of several used to illustrate why MMIW investigations needed a federal oversight framework that operated independently from local politics and interagency friction. By 2023, discussions had turned towards civil action. The Charlo family, alongside advocacy organizations, began consulting with attorneys to explore the possibility of filing lawsuits against entities that had initially handled Germaine's disappearance. These civil complaints would focus not on proving guilt for the disappearance, but on demonstrating negligence in investigative practices, failure to preserve evidence, and violations of protocol. The intention was not financial restitution, but rather official acknowledgement that the investigation had not met professional standards. The process of preparing such a lawsuit was slow and delicate, requiring documentation, testimony, and expert analysis. But it also represented the family's unwillingness to let procedural inertia bury their daughter's case. Simultaneously, Germaine's story was reaching wider audiences through media. A short-form documentary series aired on a national streaming platform included an episode on Germaine, interviewing her family members, tribal leaders, and community activists. The series emphasized the broader MMIW crisis, but rooted its storytelling in individual narratives, allowing viewers to understand the human cost of institutional inaction. Germaine's grandmother, in a particularly powerful interview, stated, "They think silence is going to make us stop, but silence is what we've lived through. Now, we're going to speak." In mid-2024, a podcast titled Vanished in Plain Sight devoted an entire season to Germaine's disappearance. The episodes were meticulously researched and included material not previously covered in traditional news outlets. They examined potential motives, retraced her final movements, and questioned the role of law enforcement during the investigation. Former officers who had since left the force shared limited but critical reflections, confirming that early evidence handling was inconsistent and that jurisdictional confusion had impacted response time. These revelations didn't lead to legal breakthroughs, but they did reignite public interest and inspired renewed calls for federal action on unresolved indigenous disappearances. The Charlo family also began pursuing funding for an independent investigative team. Through community fundraisers and support from indigenous legal aid organizations, they raised enough to retain a private forensic consultant to review any available digital data and physical evidence. While they could not compel police agencies to share sealed files, the consultant was able to reprocess open-source materials, including timestamps from social media, archived news footage, and photographs from the scene of the last confirmed sighting. His report concluded that the likelihood of abduction was highly probable, given the abrupt loss of phone signal, lack of public sightings, and her prior routine behavior. Though the report carried no legal authority, it strengthened the family's resolve to continue seeking official recognition of their daughter's case as a criminal matter, not just a disappearance. By early 2025, 7 years after Germaine was last seen, the family held a public press conference in Missoula. They presented findings from their independent review, called on federal investigators to reopen the case using updated protocols under the newly passed Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act, and reiterated their call for accountability. Tribal elders attended the event, lending ceremonial weight to the occasion. A local pastor read the names of other missing Indigenous women, creating a moment of collective remembrance and resilience. And yet, there were still no charges. No body had been found. No confession or conclusive evidence had emerged. Germaine's case remained open, officially active, but in practice, paused. Her family continued to ask the same questions they had in 2018. Where is Germaine? Who was with her that night? What did they do? For the Charlo family, the absence of closure did not mean absence of effort. It meant persistence. Persistence in memory, in action, in community, and in the belief that even in the face of silence, the truth must eventually rise.